I barely knew my mother by the time I was old enough to miss her properly. That sounds worse than I mean it to. She didn't die when I was an infant. I was 6 years old when it happened, which is old enough to have memories. And I do have them, but they are the memories of a 6-year-old, which means they are more sensory than narrative. The smell of her hair when she held me, the particular sound of her laugh, which was louder than you'd expect from a woman her size. The way she hummed while she worked, always slightly off-key and never seemed to notice or care. The specific weight of her hand on my head when she tucked me in at night. Not heavy, just present the warmth of it, communicating something that didn't need words. These are the things I carry. Not her face, not really. I have photographs for that, but the texture of being near her. The physical fact of her in a room. She died in the winter of 1991. I was told she fell. I grew up in Kargar, which is not a name you will find on many maps, and which I am using here for reasons that will become clear. It sits in a valley in South Wales. One of those valleys that was carved by a glacier and then filled by industry and then hollowed out again when the industry left. So that what remains is the landscape and the houses and the people and a kind of structural memory of what the place used to be. The mountains on either side are not dramatic. They are the modest, worn-down mountains of South Wales, green in summer and brown in winter, and perpetually misted at the tops. The kind of landscape that doesn't announce itself but accumulates on you over time until you find it has become the landscape you measure all others against. The valley floor holds the river narrow and fast-running dark, with the iron leaching from the old workings upstream. The houses climb the slopes above it in terraces, the miners' rows, though most of them haven't held miners in 40 years. Pale, rendered stone slate roofs, the kind of houses built to last by people who expected to stay. The pit, Cairngorm Colliery, had been the center of everything for 80 years. When it closed in 1985, it took with it not just the jobs, but something harder, to name some organizing principle around which the community had arranged itself. And in the years after the closure, the village turned inward in a way that I didn't fully understand as a child, but that I felt the way you feel, Weather. People who had other options left. People who had no other options or who simply could not imagine themselves anywhere else stayed, and the staying had a quality of defiance and also of grief, the two things so mixed together that I'm not sure the people doing it could always tell them apart. We did not leave when others left. Many families went to Cardiff, to England, to wherever work had moved. My father stayed. His family had been in Kargar for 4 generations, and the idea of leaving was not one he entertained. Not after my mother died, not when the pub almost closed, not when the school reduced to a single combined class of 6 children in 3 age groups. Not ever. He stayed and he worked the land. He had a small holding on the valley's eastern slope, sheep, mostly. Enough to live on if you were careful and didn't expect much beyond living, and he raised me with the help of the village women and the particular stoic tenderness of a Welshman who is not going to tell you he loves you, but who will demonstrate it in 100 practical and consistent ways every day of your life. He learned to braid my hair because there was no one else to do it. He sat with me through fevers and nightmares and the particular adolescent miseries that I would not have known how to explain to him, and didn't have to, because he simply sat there and that was enough. He drove me to the library in the next valley every 2 weeks for 10 years without being asked, because he had watched me run out of books at home and understood without discussion that this was a problem requiring a solution. I loved my father. I want to say that clearly at the outset with all the emphasis I can give it, because of what comes later. Because I need whoever is reading this to understand that what I found out did not destroy, that love did not even diminish it, really, though it complicated it in ways I am still working through. He was a good man. He was the best man I knew. What happened was not simple, and his part in it was not simple, and love is not made simple by complexity. It is just made heavier. His name was Emlyn. He was a quiet man, not unfriendly, but contained the kind of person who chose his words carefully and meant all of them, and offered none in excess of what was needed. He had worked the pit for 12 years before the closure, and had the miner's body dense strong in the shoulders, a particular quality of physical endurance that seems almost constitutional in men who have done that work. And after the closure he did not complain, and he did not drink more than was sociable, and he did not become bitter in the way that some men did, the ones who had organized their sense of themselves around the work, and found themselves without it, unsure of what they were. He adapted. He learned what he didn't know about the small holding, and he learned it thoroughly, and he got on with it, which was the phrase he used for everything, getting on with it, as if life were primarily a project of continuing rather than of feeling. What he did not do was talk about my mother. I understood this when I was young as grief, as the weight of losing a wife at 30 being too great to carry into conversation. I accepted it the way children accept the rules of the world they're born into, not because they make sense, but because they are the rules, and the rules are simply what the world is. My mother had died. My father didn't talk about it. These were simply the conditions of my life. There was one other person who didn't talk about my mother, and that was my grandmother. Nain, my father's mother, Morfood, was the most formidable person I have ever known. And I say that having now lived 41 years in the wider world, and having encountered a considerable range of people in a considerable range of circumstances. She was in her 70s when I was a child, and she was small and angular, the kind of smallness that seems more concentrated than large. And she had white hair she kept pinned up in a style that had not changed since approximately 1955, and eyes the color of slate that missed nothing and forgave little, and saw through pretension with a speed and accuracy that could be genuinely frightening if you were on the receiving end of it. She had run the village women's committee for 20 years. She had organized the strike kitchens during the miners' strike of 84 and 85, keeping families fed through the winter, with a logistical competence that people still talked about a decade later. She had a reputation for honesty so absolute that people brought her disputes to settle the way they might have taken them to a magistrate, and she settled them with the same directness, no flattery, no softening the plain truth whether or not it was welcome. She was the person I loved most in the world after my father, and she would not speak of my mother either, not rudely, 9 was never rude. She didn't need to be having other methods entirely more effective, but with a finality that made the subject feel like a sealed room, a door you knew not to try, because the quality of its sealedness communicated something beyond ordinary preference. It was not that she would become upset. It was not that she would refuse outright. It was that, when the subject arose, she would acknowledge it with a brief and complete attention. She would not pretend I hadn't spoken. She was too honest for that. And then she would redirect with the efficiency of someone who has had a great deal of practice redirecting, and the conversation would be elsewhere before you had quite registered the transition. I learned eventually not to try. The learning had its own particular sadness. I had found the edges of something I could not get past. What I knew was this. My mother's name was Seren. She had come to Cairgar from outside, from a town in Pembrokeshire on the southwestern coast, 20 miles away as the crow flies, but another world in the way of small Welsh communities, when she married my father at 22. She had been considered beautiful, which I knew from the photographs and from the quality of people's expressions when her name came up, a softening, a momentary warmth before the shutters came down. She had apparently been warm in the way of people who are genuinely interested in others, who listen as if what you're saying matters, which is rarer than it sounds. She had died in the winter of 1991 after a fall on the path above the village, the path that ran along the ridge between Cairgau and the next valley, the one everyone used for walking. She had been found the next morning by old Gethin Rees, who walked that path every day regardless of weather, which was the kind of thing Gethin did. She had been buried in the village cemetery on the hill above the valley, in a plot that my father kept meticulously visiting every Sunday with flowers from the garden in season and whatever else he could find in the off months. I visited her grave every week from the time I was old enough to go alone. I did not talk to her there. I was too old to believe in that, and too young to have grown past the self-consciousness of it, but I sat with her, which is the only word I have for what I did, and I felt in those weekly sittings something I couldn't have named then, but that I would now call the specific shape of her absence, the particular outline left by a person who should have been there and wasn't. I left Cairgar at 18. This was not common. Most of the young people who remained had stopped expecting to leave, had arranged their expectations around what the valley offered, and found ways, some of them genuinely satisfying, to make that enough. The ones who left mostly left for economic reasons. There was simply no work, and left with the particular ambivalence of people who haven't chosen to go so much as been pushed, and who carry the guilt of the pushing alongside whatever relief the going provides. I left because my father told me to. He sat me down when I was 16, and he said, in the way he said things that were not open for discussion, that I was going to finish my schooling properly and sit my A-levels and apply to university and go. He said it without preamble, without the cushioning of explanation, which was how he communicated the things that mattered most to him. The absence of softening was itself the signal of seriousness. I said I didn't want to leave him. He said that had nothing to do with it. I said the farm needed. He said the farm was fine. I said I could go to the college in the next town. Commute I didn't have to. He looked at me with those steady eyes and said, "Your mother didn't get to go anywhere. "You're going." It was the most he had ever said about her in a single sentence. I didn't push it. I went. I want to be honest about how I felt leaving. I felt guilty and I felt relieved, and I felt the particular combination of the two that produces something like shame, that specific discomfort of wanting a thing you feel you should not want. I was leaving my father on the valley slope with his sheep and his silence and the grave on the hill and the small diminishing village and all the weight of it. I was going somewhere with more oxygen in it. Both of these things were simultaneously true, and I didn't know how to reconcile them, so I put them in a place I didn't look at often, and I got on the bus to Cardiff, and then the train to Aberystwyth, and I started the version of my life that took place outside the valley. University. A degree in history, which is what happens when you are a person who grew up without answers and discovers that answers can sometimes be found in the past, that the past is not sealed, the way certain conversations are sealed, but is in fact available, documented, arguable. A place you can go with the right tools and the right patience and come back from with something you didn't have before. Then a postgraduate year. Then a job at a secondary school in Swansea teaching the same subject. Then a flat, then a long relationship that ended badly enough to teach me something useful, then a different flat. Then another relationship that ended less badly and left behind a friendship. Then the ordinary accumulation of a life conducted at a sufficient distance from where you started that you begin to believe you have put it in its proper proportion. Not left behind. Properly proportioned. I went back to Cairngorm for Christmas every year without fail. I went back in summer when the school year permitted. My father got older and quieter, and the small holding got smaller, as the demands of it exceeded what one aging man could manage, and I helped when I was there and felt the guilt of not being there more sharply each year. The way guilt of that kind sharpens in proportion to how little you act on it. Nine died when I was 26 in November in her own bedroom with my father beside her, which was the death she would have chosen had she been in the habit of specifying preferences which she was not. My father sat at her kitchen table afterwards and cried silently for what felt like a very long time, and then got up and put the kettle on. And that was the most I ever saw of his grief for her, which does not mean it was the extent of it. The thing that brought me back permanently in the end was my father's heart. A mild attack, the cardiologist was careful to call it mild, as if the adjective contained information I should find reassuring at 63, discovered when he came into A&E in Merthyr Tydfil at 6 in the morning, having driven himself, which was so entirely characteristic that I cannot think of it without a complicated laugh. He called me from the hospital. He said there had been a small issue with his heart and they were keeping him overnight for observation and I should not worry. He said all of this in the tone he used for the farm weather reports he gave me on Sunday calls, informative, unemotional. As if the information were simply information, and its emotional significance were a matter entirely for the listener to manage. I sat in my flat in Swansea and looked at the wall for a while. Then I called the school. Then I packed my car. Then I drove back to Cairngorm, which took an hour and 40 minutes, including stopping for petrol. And I parked on the slope outside the farmhouse in the early afternoon light, and I sat in the car for a few minutes, looking at the house and the valley below it, and the grave on the hill above the cemetery, just visible from where I sat, and I thought, I am going to stay this time. I was 31. I had been gone in any real sense for 13 years. Coming back felt like putting on a coat you'd grown out of, recognizable in every detail, wrong in the fit. The shoulders wrong, the length, wrong the feel of it against your body, reminding you that you were no longer the shape that coat was made for. There were perhaps 40 families left in Cairngorm by the time I came back. The village had contracted around its remaining core with the quiet stubbornness of a community that has decided collectively and without formal declaration that it is going to continue, regardless of the evidence suggesting it shouldn't. The pub, the Miner's Rest, run by a man named Geraint Bowen, who had been behind that bar since before I was born, and who seemed as permanent a feature of the valley as the slag heap on the western slope was still open, which had not always seemed certain. There was a post office that doubled as a small shop, and that was really a social service as much as a commercial one, a place where people came not just for stamps and milk, but for the exchange of information and the comfort of being recognized. There was the chapel still operating. The congregation reduced to the point where the old stone building felt extravagant for its purpose, but which nobody suggested abandoning, because some things in a community become load-bearing walls, even when they have ceased to be what they look like. And there was the network, the particular dense web of knowledge and obligation and history that sustains any small community, and that I had grown up inside and had at some point in my early 20s begun to understand from the outside as a phenomenon, had begun to see it as a historian might see it, as a system with its own logic and its own maintenance costs, and its own ways of handling elements that threatened its integrity. I knew who was related to whom. I knew who had helped whose family during the strike, who had failed to help, and that both things were remembered. I knew the old disputes and the old alliances and the silences that ran between certain families like fault lines, barely visible on the surface but structurally significant. I slotted back into this network with the ease of someone who has never fully left a thing, even when they appear to have left it. People were glad to see me, I think genuinely glad that Emlyn's daughter had come back. Glad in the specific way of a diminishing community that feels the return of anyone as a small argument against the general direction of travel. The Bowen sisters brought food the first week, which is the Welsh custom for arrivals and bereavements, and new babies, and any other occasion significant enough to merit casserole. Old Gethin Rees, the man who had found my mother on the ridge path. A fact I knew but that neither of us had ever spoken of, directly came to help with the sheep. With a matter-of-factness that made clear he had simply been waiting for someone to come back who needed the help. Mrs. Parry from the post office checked on my father with a regularity and a pretense of casualness that fooled no one but that everyone appreciated for the grace of the pretense itself. It was Mrs. Parry who first said something that mattered. She was in the kitchen one afternoon in October, ostensibly delivering a parcel that had come for my father while he was at the doctor's actually staying for tea, because she had correctly assessed that I had been alone all morning and could use the company which was typical of Mrs. Parry's particular kind of practical kindness. She identified what was needed and provided it without making you feel the identification or the provision. We were at the kitchen table with our cups, and she was telling me about various village matters in the meandering, associative way of someone who has a great deal to say and is taking the scenic route through it when she said, almost as an aside, the words placed carefully into a pause in the conversation, as if she had been carrying them for a while and had decided this was the moment. Your mother would have been proud of you, Cariad, coming back like this. She cared about this place very much. I said thank you. She said she was a good woman, different from us. She came from outside. You know how it is with that. It takes time. People need time to... She stopped. She looked at her cup with a focused attention. It didn't require. Then she said, well, she was good. She had a good heart. I said, Mrs. Parry, did you know my mother well? The expression that moved through her face was one I would come to recognize over the following months in various forms, in various people, a complex expression that combined genuine feeling with caution, warmth with calculation, the impulse to speak with the habit of not speaking. She said, everyone knew everyone in those days. The village was bigger. You couldn't help but know people, I said. But you specifically, were you close to her? She said, we were friendly. Yes, we had tea sometimes. She was good company. I said, what was she like? Nobody talks about her. I've never really understood why nobody talks about her. I know she died, and I know that's hard, but it's been 30 years, and... Mrs. Parry set her cup down. She said she was curious. Your mother, she was very curious about things, about how everything worked, about the history of the place, about the people and their families, and the way things had always been done. A pause. She asked questions. I said, what kind of questions? Mrs. Parry looked at me for a moment, really looked at me with those careful eyes, and then she said, it was a long time ago, Gwen. Your dad's doing well, that's what matters. Your home, that's what matters. She picked up her cup. How are you finding being back? And she changed the subject with the smooth efficiency of someone who has had a great deal of practice redirecting conversations, and I let her because she had that quality of certain older Welsh women of being simultaneously approachable and utterly immovable, warm and granite at the same time. And I could see that I had reached the extent of what she was going to give me in that kitchen on that afternoon. But I thought about it afterward. She was curious. She asked questions. And the particular way Mrs. Parry had looked when she said it, not fond or not only fond. Something more complicated. Something that sat between admiration and sorrow, and perhaps underneath both of those a very small and very old amount of guilt. My mother, who had come from outside, who had died at 28 on a path above the village in winter, who nobody in this community in 30 years had been willing to discuss in any real way. I had grown up with that silence and accepted it as the condition of grief. Standing in my father's kitchen after Mrs. Parry had gone, washing up the cups, looking out the window at the slope rising behind the house and the ridge path just visible at its crest, I understood for the first time that I had perhaps been wrong about the silence. That grief is not always the explanation for the things people won't say. I found the notebook on a Tuesday evening in early November. My father was in bed early. He tired quickly, still the mended heart demanding more rest than he had ever previously needed or granted it. And I was in the sitting room looking for something to read, working my way along the bookcase that took up most of one wall. My father's reading was orderly and Catholic mining history, natural history, a complete set of Welsh literature in translation that Nain had given him decades ago, various novels acquired over the years without any obvious system. I was looking for something I hadn't read when my hand reached the gap between the back of a row of books and the bookcase shelf, and found something that wasn't the shelf, a notebook. Small, dark blue cover, the kind sold in pharmacies everywhere, nothing distinctive. I opened it standing by the bookcase and I saw the handwriting, and I sat down on the floor. A woman's hand, not my father's. I knew my father's handwriting, the way you know the handwriting of people you have grown up with as a physical thing, a personality in ink. And this was not it. This was rounder with a particular forward lean, the letters formed with a speed that gave them a slight looseness, as if the writer's thoughts moved faster than the pen quite managed. There was something energetic about it, something that suggested a mind running ahead of itself. I looked at the inside front cover. A name written in the same hand, Saren Meredith Price, her book, 1990. My mother's maiden name before she took my father's. Her book, written the year before she died. I sat on the sitting room floor with my back against the bookcase and my father asleep upstairs and the wind coming off the mountain, and I read my mother's notebook from the first page to the last. She had been 27 when she started it, 28 when she stopped, not at her own decision. Reading it, I had the constant sensation of hearing a voice that I had always been told was gone, discovering that it had in fact been here all along, behind a row of books, waiting with the patience of something that had no other option but to wait. The early sections were the observations of a young woman who had come from somewhere else and was learning a new place with a historian's attention. She wrote about the valley, its light, its weather, the particular quality of mornings in Cargol when the mist sat in the river bottom, and the upper slopes were clear, and the village appeared to float between two strata of world. She wrote about the people with the affectionate precision of someone who is genuinely interested in other human beings as phenomena, their habits, their turns of phrase, the specific ways different families expressed and withheld emotion. She wrote about my father with a candor and a warmth that I will not reproduce here, because it belongs to them and not to me. But that made me set the notebook on my knee for a while and look at the wall thinking of the two of them, young, thinking of what was coming. I had a daughter, she wrote at one point, our Gwen. She is the most extraordinary thing I have ever made. She has her father's eyes, and my inability to let anything rest which I hope will serve her better than it has served me, though perhaps the combination of the two will be useful. I stopped at that and read it again. My inability to let anything rest. She had known it about herself. She had named it. Then the tone of the notebook changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but somewhere around a third of the way through the writing that had been observational and warm began to take on a different quality. The observations became more pointed. The questions there had always been questions. It was the texture of her thinking became more specific and more urgent. The handwriting subtly lost some of its looseness and became more careful, as if she were writing things she knew she ought to be careful about writing. The first passage that made me stop and read it twice was this: "Had tea with Morford again today." I tried again as carefully as I could to ask about the Howell girl, the one who died 3 years ago before Emlyn and I came. Morford was kind about it, genuinely kind. She is always genuinely kind, but she was absolutely firm. It was a tragedy. It was an accident. It happened. These things happen in winter on the mountain paths, and I should let it be. She looked away when she said it. I have known Morford for 4 years, and she does not look away from things. She faces everything. The looking away means something. Morford. My grandmother. Nine, who faced everything. I sat with that for a moment, and then I kept reading. Talked to Bronwyn Davies today. I asked her what she remembered about the Howell girl, and she said she remembered it was very sad, and that her husband had been devastated. I asked how it happened, and she described the fall, the same description everyone gives verbatim, almost the same details in the same order, as if they have all memorized the same account. I asked if anyone had been with her. Long pause. She said no, she'd been walking alone. I asked why she would be walking alone on the ridge in January in the dark. Another long pause. She said, people do, don't they? People walk at all hours. Then she changed the subject. The Howell girl was from Cardigan. She'd married into the village 6 years before she died. I stood up, went to the kitchen, and I drank a glass of water, and I stood at the sink, looking out at the dark valley, and I breathed slowly and carefully. Then I went back to the sitting room, and I sat down on the floor again, and I kept reading. I have been thinking about this for 3 months, and I have been careful, because I know how I can be. I know I can find patterns where there are. None can build a case from coincidence and confirmation bias, and the desire to make sense of things that are simply senseless. So I have been careful. I have talked to people only when the opportunity arose naturally. I have not pushed. I have not led. But here is what I have found without pushing. In the 20 years before Emlyn and I came to Kiergar, there were 4 deaths of women on the ridge path or in the upper valley. All in winter. All ruled as accidents, falls, exposure, 1, hypothermia. All of the women who died had come to Kiergar from outside. All of them had been in the village for between 3 and 8 years. All of them, as best I can piece together from careful conversations, had been women who didn't simply fit in, who had opinions, who asked questions, who were curious about the way things worked. That is 4 women in 20 years with those specific characteristics. I need to find out if the pattern holds further back, and I need to find out who knew. I put the notebook face down on my knee. I looked at the ceiling. I breathed. Then I picked it up and finished it. The later sections of the notebook were extraordinary documents. My mother had spent the better part of 18 months conducting what amounted to a covert historical investigation into the deaths of women in Kiergar, using only the tools available to her conversation, Observation, the patience to ask the same question in 17 different ways to 17 different people over many months, and the analytical intelligence to recognize what the answers added up to, even when each individual answer was designed to be incomplete. She had found a pattern that went back not 20 years, but at least 60. Women from outside women who didn't simply assimilate women who questioned dying in winter on paths or in circumstances that were ruled as accidental without much investigation. The deaths were not frequent enough to seem like anything other than the ordinary tragedy of life in a hard landscape in a hard climate. But they were consistent, and the consistency, once you had learned to look for it, was unmistakable. She had found something else, too, a reference in a conversation with an elderly woman who had since died to something the old woman had called the keeping of the valley, a phrase used almost accidentally, and immediately walked back the old woman, claiming she'd misspoken, meaning nothing by it. It was just an old expression. My mother had written. She was frightened when she realized what she'd said. Not embarrassed, frightened. Near the end of the notebook, in an entry that must have been written in November 1991, perhaps 6 weeks before she died, she wrote, "I have been trying to decide whether to tell Emlyn. I love him completely, and I know he would believe me, and I know he would be frightened for me, and I don't know what he would do with the fear. I don't know whether telling him would protect me or endanger him. I don't know whether there is anyone in this village I trust enough to tell. I think about Hugo. I think about old Gwilym at the pub. And I think maybe, I am not going to stop. I am not capable of stopping when I can see this clearly, that something is wrong. Something has been wrong for a very long time, and no one is going to say so unless someone does. That is the nature of these things. They persist because everyone who sees them decides it is not their place to be the one who says, 'It is my place. It is everyone's place. I am going to find the ones who know, and then I am going to decide what to do.'" She had not written anything after that. The next pages were blank. Then December had come, and January, and the path on the ridge. I did not go upstairs. I sat on the sitting room floor until the cold woke me at some point in the early hours, and I went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of me, and I thought for a very long time. I thought about what I had read. I thought about Morfood looking away. I thought about the specific word my mother had used, frightened, to describe the old woman who had said the keeping of the valley by accident. I thought about the pattern my mother had found, and I thought about whether she had been right, or whether she had been, as she had worried herself, finding shapes in coincidence. But my mother had been careful. She had been explicit about being careful about accounting for her own biases. She had taken 18 months. She had cross-referenced. She had not leapt. She had found something real. I was certain of it before the tea was finished. And then the next question, which was larger and heavier, and which I had been circling around since I first picked up the notebook: my father. My quiet, good father asleep upstairs with his mended heart. Had he known? Had the man who drove me to the library every 2 weeks for 10 years, who learned to braid my hair, who told me my mother would have been proud of me had he known what happened to her and simply said nothing for 30 years? I could not answer that from the notebook. The notebook only showed my mother's side. What my father knew or didn't know was a question I would have to answer another way. I needed to talk to someone first. Before I talked to my father, I needed to talk to someone who had been there, who was still alive and present, and who might have reached the point where the weight of 30 years of silence had become heavier than the alternative. I thought about Geraint Bowen. Geraint had been behind the bar at the Miners' Rest for as long as I could remember. He was in his late 60s now, white-haired and substantial, the kind of man who gives the impression of having arrived at his current form early in life and simply consolidated it over the decades. He had a reputation for discretion, the barman's discretion, the professional capacity to hear things without repeating them, and a quality of steadiness that I had always found reassuring, and that I now understood might have a more complicated source. I went to the Miners' Rest on a Thursday afternoon when I knew it would be quiet. I ordered a half. I sat at the bar. We made the small talk of people who have known each other across a large gap of time and are finding their way back to the current versions of each other. And when the small talk had settled and there was a natural pause, I said as directly as I could, Geraint, "Can I ask you something?" He said he supposed so, which is a Welsh way of saying yes, while preserving the option of saying no. I said, "I want to ask you about my mother." What happened to his face was not surprise. I have thought about that a great deal in the time since. It was not surprise. It was the expression of a man who has been expecting something for a long time and has mixed feelings about its arrival, relief and dread in proportions he hadn't predetermined. He said, "What about her?" I said I found her notebook. She was investigating deaths, women who came from outside and asked questions and died in winter. She thought she'd found a pattern going back 60 years. I watched his face. I think she was right. Geraint looked at his hands on the bar. Then he reached under the bar and produced 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey, and he poured 2 measures without asking whether I wanted one. He put one in front of me, and he kept one for himself. He said, "Who else have you told?" I said, "No one. I came to you first." He said, "Why me?" I said, "Because you've been here a long time, and because I think you're a person who carries things that have become too heavy, and because my mother's notebook said she was thinking about trusting Gwilym at the pub, and you were Gwilym's nephew." He was quiet for a very long time, long enough that I began to think he was not going to speak, that the habit of silence was going to win. Then he drank his whiskey and he set the glass down and he said, "Your mother was right." He talked for almost 2 hours. I am going to try to reproduce the substance of what he told me as accurately as I can because it matters to get this right, because the precision of it matters in a way that resists the temptation to summarize. The tradition he used that word throughout, always with the flat emphasis of someone who has thought about the word carefully and has not found a better one, and resents not finding a better one, was old. Older than the pit, older than the chapel, older than most of the structures that made Cairngorm legible as a community. Geraint's understanding of its origins was partial. It had never been written down, had been transmitted orally through specific channels, specifically between certain men, but he believed it grew from the same soil as similar arrangements in similar communities. the fierce self-preservation of a group that has learned over centuries that its survival depends on its coherence, and has developed systems to maintain that coherence against anything that threatens it. What threatened it in Kierkegaard's formulation was the question. The woman from outside who looked at the valley with clear eyes and saw it as it was, its customs, its arrangements, the things done in certain ways for so long that no one born into it questioned them anymore, and who would not be satisfied with the answers given to quiet her inquiry. Women born into the community didn't raise the particular kind of question that concerned the tradition. Because women born into it had been raised inside, it had absorbed its logic and its limits, knew the shape of the sealed rooms, and didn't try the doors. Women who came from outside sometimes did. The decision was made by what Geraint called with a grimace at the inadequacy of the word a council. Not a formal body, no records, no minutes, no official existence. The oldest men, the most established men meeting in the back room of the pub or around a kitchen table, assessing whether a particular woman had crossed from curious to dangerous, whether her questions had reached the point where the answers she was approaching could not be unlearned. And when the assessment was that she had crossed that line, when the consensus was reached, the thing was organized. Quietly, by two men never the same, two men twice arranged by a third man who never participated directly, made to look like the accidents that were plausible winter paths pour light a fall. A body found in the morning. I asked, "How many?" He said, "That I know of in my lifetime 4. Your mother and 3 before her. Gwilym knew of 4 more before that. There were stories going further back, but stories are stories. 8 women, in living memory. The pattern my mother had spent 18 months uncovering. I said, who else is still alive who knew about this? He named 3 people. 2 of them were people I knew by sight. Older men, men who had been at the edges of my childhood as background figures. One was a name I didn't recognize, someone who had left the valley 15 years ago, and whose whereabouts Geraint didn't know. I said, did my father know? This was the question I had been building toward since I sat down. I watched Geraint's face as I asked it. He said, Emlyn was told it was an accident. That's what everyone was told. The tradition protected itself by making the information extremely restricted. Only the men directly involved knew the full truth, and the woman's husband was never one of them. The community presented the husband with the story, and the story was consistent, and there was no reason to disbelieve it. He paused. Emlyn grieved her, genuinely. You've seen it. You know him. I said, he doesn't know. Geraint said, I am as certain of that as I am of anything. The relief that went through me was physical. I felt it in my chest, a loosening something that had been very tight for the hours since I had picked up the notebook, releasing enough to let me breathe properly. My father didn't know. He was a man who had lost his wife and been given a lie for it, and had carried the lie in good faith for 30 years. He was not complicit. He was another victim of it in a different register. I said, Geraint, why are you telling me this now? You could have said nothing. I came in here with a notebook and a suspicion, and you could have said it was a long time ago, and things were different, and you didn't want to speak ill of the dead. He looked at his glass. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I have wanted to tell someone since the night it happened to your mother." I sat in a room and I heard them decide, and I said nothing because I was a coward, and because I was afraid, and because I told myself it wasn't my place to stop it. I have told myself that for 30 years, and I have not believed myself for 30 years. And you are sitting in front of me, and you are your mother's daughter, and I am an old man, and I would rather say it than carry it into the ground. He said, "And because you deserve to know, she deserved better than what was done to her. You deserved a mother. The least I can do is give you the truth of it." I drove home in the dark. I sat in the car outside the farmhouse for a long time before I went in. I looked at the valley below the handful of lights, still burning the dark bulk of the slag heap on the western slope against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. I looked at the ridge above the house, just visible, the path I knew ran along it, the path where she had died. I thought about a 28-year-old woman who had been curious about things, who had come from Pembrokeshire and loved a quiet man and loved her daughter and loved this valley with the particular love of someone who has chosen a place rather than been born into it, the love that requires more conviction, who had seen something wrong and had not been able to leave it wrong, who had been 30 years in a notebook behind a row of books, waiting for someone to come looking. I went inside. My father was in the kitchen making cocoa the way he made it last thing at night, standing at the cooker with his back to me, the familiar shape of him, the mended heart beating under his jumper. He said without turning, "Good time," I said. "Fine. Quiet. Just Geraint." He said, "He's good company, Geraint." He poured the cocoa into 2 cups and handed me one, and we sat at the kitchen table, the way we had sat at kitchen tables all my life, and I looked at him across the table and I thought, not yet, not tonight. I need to know more before I give this to him. I need to make it complete enough that when I give it to him, he can hold it, that there are enough edges to it, enough shape, that it doesn't simply dissolve into the unbearable. He said, "You look tired, Gwen." I said, "I'm all right." He said, "Bed soon." I said, "Yes, soon." I spent the next 3 months building the picture. I talked to everyone Geraint had named and several people he hadn't, approaching each conversation with. The patience my mother had used, not pushing, not leading, but creating the conditions in which people who wanted to speak could do so. I found that some of them had been waiting. Not consciously, not in a way they would have named as waiting, but in the way of people who have carried something heavy for a long time and have begun to feel their age and have started to wonder about what they are going to do with the weight before they are no longer able to carry it at all. The picture that assembled itself across those months was consistent with everything Geraint had told me, and more complete. I found a woman, 83, sharp-minded, who had come to Cargar from Swansea in the 1950s and had been told the truth about the tradition as a warning when she arrived because she had shown early signs of the particular curiosity it targeted, and who had spent 60 years watching and saying nothing, who told me things that Geraint hadn't known or hadn't told me. She named names. She gave dates. She described the mechanism in more detail than I had had before. She wept while she did it, which was the first time in those 3 months I had seen anyone weep. And I sat with her and held her hand, and I thought about what it costs a person to know a wrong thing and not say it for 60 years. By February, I had what I needed: a coherent and documented account of what had been done in Cairngorm over at least 50 years, how it had operated, who had been involved, and what had happened to my mother. Not sufficient for criminal prosecution. The people most directly responsible were dead or beyond the reach of any process, but sufficient for the truth. I told my father on a Sunday in March. I had rehearsed it many times in the preceding weeks, which helped, and also didn't help the way rehearsed things both prepare you and fail to prepare you for the actuality. I sat him down at the kitchen table after breakfast, and I put the notebook between us, and I said I needed to tell him something important about my mother, and I needed him to hear all of it before he responded. He looked at the notebook, and something in his face shifted, a recognition, perhaps, of the handwriting on the cover, or simply of the gravity of what I was signaling. He put both hands flat on the table and he said, "All right," I told him. All of it. The notebook and what she had found. Geraint's account. The other conversations. The pattern. What had happened on the ridge in January 1991, and what it had been and who had decided it. He sat very still while I talked. The stillness that costs him that controlled holding that I had grown up reading as stoicism, and that I now understood as the discipline of a man who has learned in a life that has asked a great deal of him, that the only way through hard things is to stay in them and not move until you can move with intention. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. The longest silence I have ever sat in with another person. I did not fill it. I had learned from him the value of not filling silence. Then he said very quietly, "I knew something was wrong. I always knew it. I told myself it was grief making me think so. Grief looking for a reason. Looking for something to be angry at that wasn't just the terrible randomness of it. I told myself I was wrong to feel it. I said, 'You weren't wrong.'" He looked at me and his eyes were wet, and his face was doing what it does when he is holding something of a weight that requires all of him to hold, and he said, "No, I wasn't wrong." He picked up the notebook. He looked at the cover for a moment, at her handwriting, her name, her book. He set it down and pushed it gently toward me, indicating it was mine. Then he stood up and he went to the window and he looked out at the valley for a long time, and I sat at the table and gave him the time he needed. Eventually he said, still with his back to me, his voice careful and controlled, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Go to the police, then decide what else." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "She would have done the same." I said, "I know." He said, "She was extraordinary, your mother." I don't think I ever told you that properly. I said, "Tell me now." And he did. Standing at the kitchen window with his back to me, and his voice doing the thing it does when something matters enough to require all of its steadiness, he told me about her. Not the grief of her, not the loss. He had told me that in the unspoken way for 30 years. But her, who she was, the specific irreplaceable person she had been. He talked for a long time, and I sat and listened, and outside the window the valley went about its ordinary business in the March morning light, and somewhere above us on the ridge the path ran along where she had died, and where she would, I decided, in that kitchen be properly remembered. There are practical questions I imagine anyone reading this will want answered. I went to the South Wales police. I made a formal statement. I provided the notebook, the names, the accounts I had gathered over those 3 months of patient conversation. I sat across from a detective sergeant in Merthyr Tydfil, and I told the story clearly and completely, and I gave them everything I had. The men most directly responsible for my mother's death were dead. 2 of the 3 surviving council members whom Geraint had identified were elderly, and one had dementia. The third had left Wales and could not be located. The tradition itself, the mechanism, the decision-making structure, had no legal form that could be directly prosecuted. What had been done was monstrous, was real, was documented, and was substantially beyond the reach of criminal justice. The detective sergeant was thorough and careful and genuinely troubled by what she was hearing in the way of someone who is encountering something that exceeds her previous categories. She said the death could be reopened. She said the cause of death on my mother's certificate could be changed through a formal inquest process. She said it would take time and she would keep me informed, and she was sorry, genuinely, in the way that matters. The inquest took almost 2 years. My mother's cause of death was amended to unlawful killing by person or persons unknown. There was a coroner's report. There was a brief piece in the local paper and a slightly longer one in a Cardiff publication. There were no arrests, no trials, no one standing in a dock being told what they had done. I have made my peace with this, or I am making it, which is more accurate. It is ongoing, not resolved the way grief is ongoing rather than resolved. Justice in the legal sense was not available, but justice in another sense, the sense of the truth being spoken, the truth being on record, the truth being known that happened. My mother had spent 18 months trying to bring that truth into the light. It took another 30 years, but it is there now in a coroner's report, and in this account, and in the knowledge of everyone who has been told, which is a growing number. My father is 73. He is well, or as well as a man his age with a mended heart can be, which is actually quite well if you manage it. We live on the small holding together. I did not go back to Swansea. I teach history now through an online program, and I have written a long account of what I found and what happened that is more formal than this one, more documented, intended for an audience of researchers and historians interested in community violence and the maintenance of social order in closed communities. It has been read by people who study such things, and they have told me my mother was right in her methodology and extraordinary in her persistence, and that her notebook is a remarkable historical document. I told them she was also, among other things, my mother, and that the historical document was written by a woman who hummed off-key while she worked and laughed too loud and braided her daughter's hair and had a good heart and should not have died on a path in January at 28. They agreed. They were sorry. Kergar has perhaps 15 families now. The Miner's Rest changed hands after Geraint retired, sold to a young couple from Cardiff who serve craft beer and have made the pub warmer in every sense. The Ridge Path has a proper waymarker now and is walked regularly in summer by people from outside the valley who come for the views, which are considerable. The views have always been considerable. The valley is a valley and the mountains are mountains, and neither of them is responsible for what happened in the community that sat between them. I still visit my mother's grave every week. I have done it for as long as I can remember, and I do it still in all weathers, which in South Wales means frequently in rain. I talk to her now. I am past the age of being self-conscious about it. I tell her about my father and about the seasons, and about what I have been writing and what I have been thinking. I told her about the notebook, about finding it on a Tuesday night behind a row of books with the rain on the windows, about sitting on the floor and reading her handwriting for the first time, about hearing her voice in it, not literally but in every real sense, about the woman I found in those pages, curious, careful, brave in the specific way of people who cannot choose not to be, who encounter a wrong thing and find the choice already made before they've consciously made it. I told her I was sorry it took 30 years. She could not have known when she hid that notebook behind the books that it would be there for 30 years before anyone found it. She could not have known whether anyone would ever find it. She hid it and she kept going, and 6 weeks later she died. And the notebook waited in the dark behind the books through 4 decades of seasons, and through my childhood, and through my leaving, and through my father's quiet decades alone, and through my coming back, waited with the patience of something that has no other option. I found it, ma'am. I found it, and I read every word, and I did what you would have done. The thing you always did, the thing you couldn't help doing, and the thing you passed to me without knowing you were passing it. The thing I used to think I got from my father, but that I know now was yours all along. I could not leave the wrong thing alone. Neither could you. That is the whole inheritance, and it is enough. It is more than enough. She asked questions. She wanted to understand things. She had a good heart. That is what Mrs. Parry said about her 30 years after she died, in a kitchen with tea going cold on the table, and she said it with the expression of someone keeping a door firmly shut. And what she didn't know, what I have spent several years now making sure everyone knows, is that the door is open now. It has been open since the night I found the notebook, and I am keeping it open.